Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katerina Schenke, and I am an educational psychologist who studies motivation, digital learning environments, and social emotional learning. We're going to have an amazing morning with Emily and Vanessa, where they will compare descriptions of family quality of life from perspectives of Korean immigrant and Canadian families of children with autism. Findings will highlight how cultural values and differences may translate into different ideas about quality of life. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about our sponsor, Reach Learning. Reach Learning is a platform that helps children build important life skills and relieve stress and burden from families by connecting them with the right experts. We will launch our platform soon, and we're going to give parents and therapists an exclusive look at our website to collect feedback. So if you're interested in giving us feedback on the platform, you can go here, asdreach.com/participate, and mention that you're coming from this event, and we'll give you a gift card for your participation. We also have developed some educational games that are designed specifically for children that need special accommodations, such as children who are sensitive to sounds. So we have a yoga game that is free on our website, and we're going to have another game coming up about emotional awareness and helping kids, especially with autism, advocate and identify their emotions. We're also running events each month. Our next event is on November 19th, and this is actually one that I'll be giving about what parents need to know about screen time. And you can RSVP at asdreach.com/events. We also provide resources and daily tips for parents on our social media. So you can see we have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Please follow us there if you're on these social media platforms. And I will introduce Dr. Emily Gardiner and Vanessa Fong. So Emily Gardiner conducted her PhD research in the Autism and Developmental Disorders Lab in the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University. She's currently a postdoc fellow with the Department of Pediatrics at the University of British Columbia and is conducting her research at the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. Her research interests include family impact and quality of life when there's a child with a developmental disability, the role of services that support both the child and family, and exploring navigation services that help families of children with disabilities to connect to resources, supports, and services in their communities. Vanessa Fong is a PhD student in the Experimental Developmental program at Simon Fraser University. She received her BS from the University of Toronto and completed her master's at the University of London. Her research interests include ASD, executive functioning, quality of life, and understanding cross-cultural differences. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Emily Gardiner and Vanessa Fong start.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and share my screen. And then Vanessa and I can get started. Does it look good, Vanessa?
Yep, that looks good.
Great.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so for this presentation, we're going to talk about a project that involves comparing Korean immigrant families and Canadian families on their definitions of family quality of life. So this study that we'll be talking about today was part of a larger study that looked at families of children with autism living in BC and looked at, in addition to their definitions of quality of life, looked at facilitators and barriers accessing services and supports. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is just an outline of topics that will be covered in this presentation. First, we'll go over definitions and key terms to familiarize ourselves with concepts that will be covered. in this presentation, and then we'll look at the research question. We'll provide some context and rationale for the study, and then we'll talk about the results and conclusions and some implications for developing and administering culturally sensitive assessments. Okay. So culture can have very different meanings and definitions. It can refer to a person's ethnicity, language, their nationality or religion. It can also be defined as groups who share similar traditions, beliefs, customs, history, and folklore. So why is culture important? So it impacts who we are and affects how we express ourselves, both as part of a group and as individuals. So in this study, we'll be comparing Korean immigrant families and Canadian families, but it's important to keep in mind that even within these cultures, there's so much diversity and heterogeneity. These seemingly like distinct groups, they're not homogeneous and the same, even within these cultures. Okay, so I think because this is a pretty small group, we won't break out into rooms. We'll kind of present this question to everyone, and feel free to unmute yourself and just unmute yourself, or you could also type in the chat. What does family quality of life mean to everyone, mean to all of you guys? So what do you think of when you hear this concept of family quality of life? What are things that are important to you?
I'm just going to jump in here. Vanessa, I can't see the chat. So if people, I don't know if you can.
Okay, I could look, yeah, I can see it.
You can, but yeah, so people are saying I can't.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll provide some examples. So some people think that enjoying family time together is really important. Other families mention like financial security as being important. Does anyone else have any other ideas of what family quality of life means to you?
Maybe when my children thrive and me as a person thrive, this is a quality of life and I'm happy.
Yeah, that's a great definition. Does
I
anyone
see one person mentioned in the chat mental health for the entire family.
That's a great one. Yep.
I also feel about social like support in the family system, like from the like closer family participant, and also like a broader family, that you have a support with other members. It's really important too.
Yeah, that's a really good one. So not just supports within the family, but also like a broader network, social network.
Yes.
That's great. Are there any other definitions or aspects that are important? Okay, these are really good. We'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we'll talk about how family quality of life is understood and conceptualized in research. So in research, one of the most well-known definitions is that family quality of life is when the conditions of the family, their needs are met, and family members enjoy their life together and have the chance to do things which are important to them. So assessments for family quality of life comprise of both subjective and objective elements. So subjective elements would be things like emotional well-being, whereas objective elements will include things like a family's resources, their access to healthcare, and things like that. So family quality of life, it's a dynamic concept. So it recognizes that outcomes of the family, they're dynamic, they're fluctuating, and they change over time. It's also individually and family oriented. So this means that it considers individual characteristics, for example, characteristics related to the child with disability, but it also considers family level characteristics. So the composition of the family, whether there are multiple children in the household, the relationships between partners and between family members. And it's also, this concept emphasizes family individuality. So it recognizes that every family is different and they may show various strengths and challenges across different domains. And lastly, this concept is multidimensional. So it considers various domains or areas of functioning. So it'll look at things like parenting, like one of you said, the emotional and psychological aspects, but also available resources and supports for the family. So next slide. So what's central to this concept is that perception is a key element. So where one family may perceive a similar situation in a positive light, either as an opportunity or a blessing, another family in a similar situation may perceive a greater negative impact. So this is illustrated by these two quotes from two different families, where one family stated that autism has made us realize how precious and great to make each day. We love life. Whereas another family said that we realized the truth, and by the end of the day, we were distraught because we knew the truth about it. It was actually the worst day of our lives. That was the day we came to terms with the fact that we had this problem. So again, just perception is very critical to this concept of family quality of life. Next slide.
Sorry guys, I'm having a little trouble here advancing the slides. Okay. So there are two main centers that have really produced the bulk of research in family quality of life. And this is how they have conceptualized the multidimensionality that characterizes family quality of life. So although framed somewhat differently, you can see that they've used sort of different titles for their domains. Research that has compared how well the two measures sort of overlap, or the degree of distinction between the two, actually shows that there's sort of significant overlap in the content that's covered. And I think what's really important about these two research centers is that both sought extensive sort of community feedback when they were developing these measures. So feedback from families of children with a range of disabilities, from service providers, from sort of other researchers, and as well as self-advocates. So it's sort of nice to know that these were actually informed by the participant group of interest, or the population of interest. So the Beach Center Family Quality of Life Scale is one both Vanessa and I have used in research, and it's, I think, by far the most commonly used tool. And that's because it sort of provides sort of the best and broadest snapshot when you're trying to access a broad range of participants and not have too high a kind of a response burden on them. So this is a 25-item tool that covers 5 domains of quality of life. Family interaction, which refers to the relationships among and between family members. Parenting, meaning the kinds of activities families engage in to facilitate their child's development. Emotional well-being, just like someone brought up, involving perceptions of stress and availability of support. Physical and material well-being, so this refers to sort of how satisfied families are that their basic sort of physical and health needs are met, like access to medical support or transportation. And then disability-related support, which includes supports across community contexts, including school, work, and home. And question responses, it's a closed-ended tool, so responses range from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. It takes about 20 minutes to complete, and it's a psychometrically valid tool. And here's a quick snapshot of the first 5 questions. So my family enjoys spending time together. That's looking at, that would tap into the family interaction domain. We help children learn to be independent. That's parenting. Has the support we need to relieve stress. That's emotional well-being. Same with have friends or others who provide support. And my family members help the children with schoolwork and activities. That's also parenting.
Okay, so research in this area comparing family functioning and parenting in autism and other developmental disabilities has demonstrated that families of children with autism report elevated stress and increasing demands. So social difficulties are at the core of this disability, which may lead to challenges for children and their families in building relationships with others, which can be really isolating. And because autism has a high genetic component, other family members may also be impacted in some way. In addition to these, the presence of behavioral problems, which can be common in autism, can present challenges for families, raising overall stress levels. So studies that have compared quality of life across various disabilities have shown that families of children with autism demonstrate the lowest satisfaction across most domains compared to families of children with Down syndrome, ADHD, and typically developing children as well. In particular, the domains which families of children with autism report the lowest satisfaction is in the area of career preparation, and also leisure and enjoyment of life. So these domains, they report the lowest satisfaction in. So this finding of lower family quality of life will depend on specific characteristics of the child, such as their symptom severity, the presence of behavioral problems, but also adaptive functioning. So things like social skills, communication, and daily living skills as well. Okay, so why is family quality of life important? So it's important for researchers and clinicians to assess family quality of life as an outcome to determine where families are needing more supports and services. It's used to figure out, are there areas where families report the lowest satisfaction? And if so, how can we specifically target these areas and strengthen them where families report low satisfaction, where they show that they're struggling or show difficulty. This can also help guide service providers and clinicians in their recommendations for where families should allocate already limited funding and resources in order to maximize benefits.
Yeah, I'll just also add, Vanessa, I think the point that these measures are subjective really lend themselves, I think, to a family-centered approach, because it's not, it's the family telling you, it's letting them sort of lead in telling you what their areas of concern are, and what's important to them.
Right, that's a really good point. Thanks for adding that. So most of the research informing our understanding of family quality of life has primarily come from Western contexts, where participants tend to represent a very small slice of the population. So they tend to come from high socioeconomic status groups, they're highly educated, and they're mostly white samples. So this can be problematic because our understanding of family quality of life and what is important to families may not be representative of the entire population. So it's possible that as a result, there may be culturally bound assumptions inherent in these tools. In other words, what we think is important to all families in defining their family quality of life may only be relevant to families who live in Western contexts, have high income, are highly educated, and things like that. So recently, there has been a growing recognition for this need to assess culturally and linguistically diverse families. So this leads us to our current project, where we assessed understanding and definitions of family quality of life in Korean and Canadian families. Okay, so this table was created with our community collaborator or co-researcher, Bo-Sang Lee, who's also here, hello. So some of you may know him. So he has been so involved, engaged, and is such a crucial member of our research team. So we developed this table together. But if you have any feedback on this chart or feel like we're missing something or disagree with anything, please feel free to just interrupt or type in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback. So it's quite challenging making comparisons across cultures because there's so much variation and diversity even within a given culture. But this chart is meant to just kind of make very general comparisons. So when we're comparing the two cultures in terms of interpersonal style, so this is how individuals relate to each other. Korean culture tends to be organized and structured more hierarchically. So things like respect for elderly is highly valued in this culture. It's also a very collectivistic culture. So there's this greater emphasis on the needs of the group rather than individual or personal needs or goals. Whereas in Canadian culture, it tends to be more egalitarian and individualistic. So there's greater emphasis on personal needs and goals over those of the group. In terms of communication styles, so Koreans will tend to use more indirect and implicit language. In a lot of East Asian cultures, lack of eye contact is seen as a sign of respect, whereas in Canadian cultures, lack of eye contact might be interpreted as being rude. Canadians tend to be more direct or forward and also explicit in their communication styles. Studies have also shown that there are differences in terms of views towards disability when comparing cultures. So in Korean culture and most Asian cultures, there's a lot of stigma surrounding individuals with disability. So studies have looked at lay theories of what causes disability in different cultures. And this research has shown that in some East Asian cultures, many people believe that a child's disability is caused by things like poor parenting, poor prenatal practices, not recognizing the genetic component of most neurodevelopmental disabilities. There's also this fatalistic view, which is common in a lot of East Asian cultures. There's a very literal meaning of disability. This view like they can't do anything, and there are no opportunities for improvement. Whereas Canadians, arguably, they tend to be more accepting and inclusive of individuals with disability. And lastly, in terms of values, so individuals from Korean cultures tend to value interdependence. This may have some basis in Confucianism and Confucian values, such as filial piety, devotion to family, group harmony, and again, that hierarchical structure. On the other hand, Canadian cultures, in Canadian cultures, individuality and autonomy seems to be more valued. So independence is kind of the goal. Having children move out of the home and be independent is something that's valued. Okay, so our research questions for the current study was first, how do Korean immigrant families and Canadian families of children with ASD define family quality of life? And the second one was, what are the similarities and differences across families in their definitions of family quality of life? So for the our participants in this study, the Korean sample included 13 Korean immigrant parents between the ages of 39 and 59, and their children between the ages of 6 and 33. For the Canadian sample, there were 15 parents included between the ages of 30 and 59. And the age range of their children was between 6 and 17.5 years. So the Korean sample, the children were slightly older than the Canadian sample. So our methods. So we conducted, for the Korean families, I conducted some of the interviews along with Bo-sang, and the interviews for Canadian families was done by Emily. And the interview question, which was the focus of this study, asked parents to define family quality of life. This was the very first question in the interview. And again, the current study with the Korean families involved a community engagement approach. So we'll talk about this in the next slide. Yep. So community engagement is an approach or paradigm which recognizes the expertise of members that belong to the community being studied, so the autism community in this case. It recognizes that these stakeholders, which can be individuals with autism, their parents, their caregivers, these individuals are in the best position to identify and set research priorities in this field. So this approach involves engaging or collaborating with members that belong to these communities in planning and implementing the study. So community engagement can be used at any stage of the research, but for this study, this approach was used throughout in terms of planning the study, identifying the research question, recruitment, and implementing the study, doing the interviews with our parent partner. And our parent partner was also involved in the analysis stage and identifying some themes and codes after interviews. Okay, so now I'll just talk about what we found, our results. So some themes that emerged from the interviews included acceptance from society, the importance of religion and respect. All of these aspects were important in how families define their family quality of life. So things like acceptance from society, feeling a sense of belongings, not just in their communities, but in society as a whole. Religion, faith, spirituality, all of these things were central for many of the families that were interviewed in helping them achieve high family quality of life, but also in terms of helping them come to terms with their child's diagnosis. And also respect, so being treated with respect, whether it was from professionals or service providers who interact with these families, this was also seen as important to this group.
So for the Canadian families, initially, like what came up already today, families spoke very generally about how access to support was an extremely important component of how satisfied they felt with their own family quality of life. And then later elaborated on the sort of successes they had and the considerable challenges they had encountered in this domain. Overall, they spoke about how having good relationships with service providers really helped them to feel supported and helped them to see that their child was making progress. But they certainly also spoke a lot about how the sort of constant demands of being their child's service navigator was very draining. They shared about the importance of emotional well-being and how if family demands were eased, sort of the overall family environment could be one, sort of characterized by more optimal emotional health and well-being. With regard to individual characteristics, family members described how the individual members' attributes sort of contributed to the overall family environment and quality of life. And finally, families very frequently contextualized their own challenges in relation to what they saw other families going through. And I'll elaborate on all of these themes in some of the upcoming slides.
So I'll just quickly talk about some of the similarities. So for both the Korean and the Canadian sample, both talked about the importance of sacrifice and personal sacrifice, whether it was career goals. A lot of families from the Korean sample had to move to a completely foreign country and had to leave behind many families and friends back home, and also giving up certain lifestyles and hobbies to prioritize their family. Another similarity was in terms of family interactions. So family members emphasize the importance of family harmony, quality of relationships between members. These things were central in their definitions of family quality of life. So both groups mentioned these things. Okay, so going into more detail, one of the main themes was family cohesiveness for the Korean families. So a number of parents mentioned the importance of encouragement. So supporting each other's goals, whether it was their spouses or their child with disability. Many families highlighted the importance of acknowledging strengths in each other. So one quote, or one parent mentioned that the most important thing is my relationship with my child. You need to believe in your child that he or she can do anything. So this importance of encouragement was central to these families. Another sub-theme for this main theme of family cohesiveness was understanding. So families expressed having the same mind and being thoughtful and aware of each other's emotions and being on the same page. This was really important. Sharing the good and the bad with each other and being supportive of both. So this required patience and accepting differences at times, also recognizing each other's limitations or difficulties as they are. So one parent mentioned, my husband and I like to set a goal for my son's life, his future. So we like to pursue the same goals without any different ideas. We have the same ideas to set out his future. That's what same mind means. Another theme was value orientation. So again, many families mentioned the importance of personal sacrifice, whether it was moving to Canada, sacrificing their careers or lifestyles to support their families. This was not necessarily seen as a bad thing. It allowed some parents to reevaluate and reprioritize their goals, which they said brought them closer to their families. So one parent said, I thought I had to spend more time at work to achieve some worldly goal for myself and make more money and get promotions. That was the goal. But when I realized my son has autism, then I had to change my lifestyle. I had to think more about my family and what's the definition of happiness? What's the definition of life? What's the value for life? It's not only about making money and promotions. I started to think about what other values are important for families. And then I changed the priority of my life and of my family values. And so the last theme was acceptance from society. So achieving family quality of life meant fulfilling the sense of belonging and inclusion in their communities. So government support and policies to support their child with disability was mentioned by a number of families as being important in reaching a high family life. Having supports in the community that are accessible in their language and in their culture, this was seen as important as well. So family-centered programs that are culturally safe and have incorporated Korean values and Korean cultures into their development and planning, this was also this was highly valued. So one parent said, we like to create programs in accordance to my son's condition. We like to have programs where we can share our culture together. We can share our food together. We have the same mind, same feelings, and we create our own programs. So this was seen important in their definition of quality of life.
So to elaborate on the themes that came out for Canadian families, family interactions was also, a very prominent theme discussed by this sample, with participants describing both harmonious interactions, often focusing on marital cohesion, as well as discordant interactions. And they talked about friction among spouses, but also within parent-child relationships. Harmonious interactions were most frequently described with caregivers describing their spouses as supportive and understanding, and highlighted the importance of agreeing on their child's intervention. So one mom was talking about her and her husband, and she said, we're drawn to different things. So she was referring to different approaches for her child. But we would oftentimes use each other's. Between the two of us, we centralized. I think we were both open. And for those who discussed discordant interactions, individuals described spousal friction. So one mom said, my husband, he always criticized what I tried to do with our son's program, because if he didn't act the way he wanted him to, it's obviously my fault because I didn't get the right programs in place. Not on a different page. My husband's not on any page. He couldn't have cared less. Support was frequently discussed as an important component of family quality of life, and family members described aspects of both formal and informal support. The majority of these discussions focused on how insufficient access or availability to needed support could have a significant and negative impact on family quality of life. So the first quote, it was referring to more access to more formal services. And this was from a foster parent who was, I think her son was about 18, and she was reflecting on the sort of impending change in service access their family is going to experience. And she said, for our future quality of life, I'm very concerned because I am their mom. I'm a foster parent. I guess they turn 19, I can walk away. But that's not what will happen here. So how do I support him? And another mom, in reflecting on access to social support, said, when you have no one that you can talk to about these things, that isolates you more. Your world shrinks dramatically, which really does impact the family. And within emotional well-being, caregivers reflected on the importance of this, describing both aspects of personal fulfillment and sacrifice. So within personal fulfillment, caregivers equated quality of life with being happy and experiencing an absence of stress. One parent said, you know, family quality of life to him was harmony in the home. So without that overbearing demand to try to continually adjust their child with ASD's behavior, to live at least part of your life in a normal fashion. And within personal sacrifice, caregivers spoke about sacrificing their own physical and emotional health, as well as personal aspirations, in order to devote their energy to their children. So one mom said, you know, it takes a toll on your own health because you're doing so much for the other, you forget yourself. And I referenced in that sort of intro slide about individual characteristics. So how participants described how the individual attributes, individual family member attributes contributed to the overall quality of life satisfaction in the family. And a lot of caregivers focused on positive caregiver qualities that they had felt made a very impactful difference for their family, such as resourcefulness, advocacy, motivation, positivity, as well as particular challenges their children experienced. So one father said, you know, a lot of these kids with autism, they cause a lot of stress. It's like this vicious circle that we have managed to stay on top of because his wife was so motivated. Another mom said, we feel like prisoners in our own home. Our child finds it very hard to go to restaurants or malls, to go grocery shopping, just the normal everyday things. So we're prisoners. And caregivers often made comparisons to other families. They reflected on how poor levels of child capacity, such as being, lower functioning or having more behavior problems, or even caregiver capacity. So if there was higher levels of parental disagreement, how this could negatively impact quality of life. So although the caregivers in our Canadian sample, certainly described their own challenges, it was very interesting to us that almost all of them acknowledged ways that that particular circumstances could present additional struggles, and they described feeling lucky, feeling blessed, and very appreciative of what they had. One father said, every child on the spectrum is radically different. And for children that are nonverbal or non-communicative, there's a different level of frustration and effort and anxiety. And another parent said, we're so fortunate that we agree for the most part. That really alleviates so much stress.
Okay, so now to conclude, we'll just summarize some of the main themes again. So to summarize, different themes emerged as important in Korean families compared to Canadian-born families. Things like personal sacrifice, the importance of religion and acceptance in society emerged as important for Korean families in their definitions. So current assessments of family quality of life tend to not include this aspect of spirituality and religion. Emily just let me know recently that one of the family quality of life surveys out there, they do include this domain called influence of values, but they group religious, spiritual, cultural, community together. But these questions really focus on access to support from this area, and less about how spirituality or religion influence their understanding of disability, or also or how they facilitate coping. So these things are not currently assessed in these tools widely. Also, acceptance in society was an important theme for Korean families.
And for the Canadian families, the fact that comparisons to other families was such a strong theme, almost every one of our 15% participants spoke about it. This is not something that's within any of the commonly utilized tools. And, I think this highlights the importance of qualitative research, but, the kinds of comparative appraisals that families were sort of contextualizing their own situations and their own struggles and strengths within, families were saying, it could be worse for some ways. They were looking at their blessings, and it was a way for them to really appreciate their family's sort of capabilities and what they did have. And the absence of these factors, I think, shows that close-ended surveys certainly play a very important role, even in opening up these conversations. But I think quality of life is such a broad and such an individual construct. Really, there's a lot of room for discussion and sharing in this area. Do you have anything to add for this one, Vanessa?
No, I think that's good. Okay, so before we suggest some recommendations that we thought of in terms of, what culturally sensitive tools look like, we'd like to ask the group and maybe get your input on what do you think culturally sensitive tools or sensitive assessments look like? What are your views on this? And again, you could unmute yourself, or you could type in the chat box what you think this looks like. Does anyone have any ideas for assessing different cultures? What's important to consider when working with culturally diverse families? How to go about doing these types of assessments?
Maybe even also any reflections on sort of accessing or partnering or engaging these groups, these sort of often harder to reach groups in developing assessments, or in quality of life assessments. Because I know part of my own research that we've looked at for this, we had a quite a large sample of families from British Columbia, just I think under 200. And when we looked at the demographics, it's really reflecting a lot of the issues that Vanessa brought up. Sort of quite a narrow sample of what the population of BC really looks like. So obviously getting at some of these what have been termed harder to reach groups requires sort of special efforts, and it should. But I think that might be another area that we'd love to hear some feedback on or suggestions on.
I have like comments from Instagram, because we are live on Instagram. So she mentioned it's a priority, family time, and also cultural behaviors should be considered. So family time and cultural behavior.
Yeah.
Are there specific examples of cultural behaviors? Because I also think that's really important to to consider.
Yeah, I think just this area is just so new. It's so lacking in the body of literature. We have not done a good job. Vanessa has done a great job at getting this going, but to date, it's really been neglected, I think.
She's asking, how do I unmute her? I will see how can I connect the Instagram live and let you know.
Yeah, I've never done that before. I'm not sure how to do that.
think there is a comment in the chat that I'll read.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how to go about answering this question, but I'm thinking a scale in the assessment that shows how willing they are to try more, ... Western values, question mark. I noticed that Asian culture is very rigid and not open to receiving the support it seems like they're looking for. We know their willingness to try new things. That becomes more helpful with providing resources from the assessment.
That's a really good point. And something that I've noticed too with looking at, with interviewing some of the families, is that they've said this exact thing, is that, you know, it's the families that need that support that are sometimes less willing to go out and find it, because, you know, there are so many barriers in the system, right? In addition, language barriers are a huge thing. You know, so even just getting past that sometimes, you know, and then other families have mentioned like interactions with service providers where they noticed and they picked up on this like lack of sensitivity, lack of patience, and things like that. So yeah, I completely agree with what you said, Serena. So thank you for that comment. Is there anything else? Maybe we could also go through, maybe do you want to go through our recommendations, and then you could also.
We can see. Yeah.
We have here. Yeah, they can hear you right now.
Okay, good.
Hi, how are you? My name is Tabitha. I'm I'm an autism mom, as well as a physician assistant, registered dietitian, and author. And I had contributed the behavioral cultures because, you know, some behaviors are accepted with certain cultures and some are not. So for me personally, you know, my son has autism. He's just turned 18, and he has significant behavior challenges, which have, I mean, so significant that, you know, hospitalizations have been required. Some parents believe in spanking. Some parents believe in not spanking. Some parents believe that, you know, you should punish or not punish. I mean, it just varies, I mean, with different cultures. I don't think that, you know, it's really any specific type of response to a behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That matters as far as like physical response or whatnot. I really think that it's really how each child is individual, and how you have to just know your child. You know, you have to know your child, and you have to know what works. So I'm also a YouTuber, and I just started a series called Revamp: Revelations of an Autism Mom Professional. And it's under Tabitha's Writes. So you can check it out. Tabitha's Writes, like WRITES, like writing a book. And I'm going to be changing it to Revamp. But the reason I started this channel was, you know, my journey through autism has been crazy, totally unbelievable. And, you know, I think that the biggest problem I'm finding is people don't know their child, and they're not giving them a chance to actually be out in the public and really just, you know, manage things accordingly, but at the same time, you know, without being embarrassed. And instead of being embarrassed to take your child out, you know, I think you should still take them out, because that's the only way they're going to learn how to act in public. And when the culture comes in, I find that, you know, certain cultures will choose to not bring their child out. So in order for a child with autism to actually to learn what it's like to be in the public eye, and to kind of get that understanding of, okay, I do this and I don't do that, they have to go out. So, you know, when certain cultures choose to leave their child home in solitude and just let them, you know, sit behind the scenes and never get exposure, I just find that that's really a disadvantage to the child. So, yeah, so that's why I mentioned behavior. And family time, I also mentioned that was really a huge factor, because, you know, family is key, and connecting with your family before you go out into the environment is first and foremost, you know, because your family, everything, the foundation starts at home. So when you're out in the public setting and whatnot, those family values will hopefully kick in, even with autistic children that are high functioning. So that's really more, I guess maybe the area I'm directing in the more high functioning children, because your children that were low functioning, they may have more challenges with that. So that was the point I wanted to make.
I think you bring up great points. I mean, certainly behavior problems, for family quality of life and parenting, stress and family impact are so impactful. But the other point you brought up is something that I've heard from other parents, that I've spoken with about bringing children out, into the community, sort of getting past your worries about, perceptions of negative social judgment and, people who are going to judge your child for having, an invisible disability. But the baby steps to sort of forming a community around your child, if you go to the same, supermarket every day and you sort of get to know the staff that works there, it's like little pieces of forming a community for your child, getting to know your neighbors, that the child sort of, you create almost like a safer space for them, and you, because you sort of maybe reduce some of those, some of your own worries, I think, about what might happen if you take them out and they have a meltdown or,
Right. Well, that's my point exactly. I think that, bringing that awareness to families is important because they are not looking at it from that perspective, going to a certain supermarket every week or whatever and getting to know the staff. And I mean, I think that it's really more or less a form of just, pure embarrassment. They just don't want to, or they don't want to be bothered with the behavior, so they just choose to leave the child at home. And that is really a serious disadvantage, especially when the child is young. That is the best time to actually get them out because, it's more understandable when you're young. But when you're 18, 19, 20, and you take them out and for the first time, then it's going to be a problem. And, with society being the way that it is, for example, my son, he does not look like he has a disability at all. But if he gets out in public and starts acting out, no one's going to understand that. No one is going to know he has autism. They will, react first and then ask questions later. So, yeah, I think that getting that awareness out is huge. So that's part of what I do with my YouTube channel Revamp. And I would really appreciate if you guys could actually just take a look at my channel. There's one video that I did, which is called, I forgot the name of it, but it's Society's View, Autism from Society's View. And that was a perfect example because, my son had a major tantrum in the store and all these people were like staring and looking at me and all of these things. But that didn't bother me as an autism mom. That wasn't an issue because I'm like, okay, whatever. But, it's getting that message across to people to let them know, hey, look, it's okay. As long as your child is not hurting anyone, this is your child's typical behavior. You're teaching them while they're out. I mean, it's baby steps. Like you said, you have to just kind of gradually build up their tolerance to that. But if you leave them in the house, that's the biggest problem I have because I have a lot of friends who have children with autism and they are not bringing them out because they're, like, well, I just can't deal with the behavior. I'd rather just, leave them home. It's easier that way. Easier is not always better. So that's my point. So yeah, I just would like to get my message out to so many parents because I'm trying to really not just build my community, but I want to reach people from a mother's standpoint, from a professional standpoint, and I kind of try to break it down in a way that it's very, layman's terms, very personable because, people need to understand. And no one, if you don't have a child with autism, sometimes they just don't get it, but I get it because this is what I do. I'm a mom with autism, with the autism child. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned a really good point too when you were talking about spanking and disciplining, and that made me think back to this question of how do we approach families in a culturally sensitive way. And something that we didn't have on this next slide was having this non-judgmental approach. and being aware that there are people have different parenting styles and different backgrounds and different cultures, different cultures that influence their parenting. And these, there's not necessarily a right and wrong way. Being open and having this non-judgmental approach is really important. So that just made me think of that. So thank you for that point.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abby.
Of course. Okay, so I think we're running out of time, so I'll just quickly go through these. So our last slide, so culturally sensitive assessments and some of our recommendations. Oh, sorry, Emily, did you want to go first?
No, I don't think so. I think you go ahead.
Okay, so our results indicate that it's important to assess areas of strength and resilience in families. So not just looking at difficulties and deficits. As I've seen from the families that I've interviewed and met, there's so much resilience and strength in these families. And I don't think that this is captured a lot in research. So it's important for future research to recognize and acknowledge this. This information about resilience can potentially help a lot of other families in their journey and their coping. And lastly, these tools should be available in multiple languages and delivery formats to accommodate different communication styles, because a lot of families have mentioned that language is a huge barrier. Yeah, Emily, do you want to?
I think the only thing I would sort of re-emphasize is, at its core, family quality of life is subjective, it's multidimensional, and it's dynamic. So it's not a static concept, it's changing, it's based on, it's individual to the family, it changes over time, on whatever scale that might be, day to day or over the years, etc. And it's certainly influenced by what is going on, inside the family and outside. So there's no one size fits all of, conceptualization or approach to measuring this. But, as researchers and, even as clinicians, I think sometimes we get stuck on these tools that we have available because we know, they're psychometrically valid, and, we can use them, and they give us sort of a quick and dirty snapshot of what's going on for that family. But I think we have to remember that the importance of qualitative approaches in research and of sort of open discussion in clinical practice, and really letting the family sort of be our guide for what is important to them. We might look at a particular area of development for the child and think, they need to focus on that. But if that's not important for the family, the starting place is really what matters to them. So I'll end there.
Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I wanna just I just wondering what would be kind of a new recommendation for policymakers from this research, especially for Korean families or other ethnic families, because I remember one of the research goals was to recommend policy or something to improve the quality of life of these families.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Bo-sang. Do you have any ideas in terms of policy recommendations?
No, not really from this. So that's why I'm asking, what would these research results give or recommend or hints for the policymakers?
I mean, I can speak generally about some of the conclusions we came out with from the sort of broader study. And I think if there was a way to sort of make them culturally attuned, these sort of general recommendations that might get at some of this. I mean, I think from the broader study, one thing that came out was, I think how lost families feel in the sort of sea of service delivery options. ASD is one of the diagnoses in BC that is directly tied to funding. So you get this diagnosis, you get access to this funding. But then I think parents feel quite alone in how to navigate that, how to execute the funding, and how do they know they're using it, most appropriately and not being taken advantage of, et cetera, et cetera. So having some sort of navigator that can kind of partner with families along that journey was something that many families expressed. Now I lost my train of thought on the other one. Oh, and then services for the funding model to support services for the family unit. So right now it's really just on the 6+ autism program, it's really just child behavior or child interventions that are covered, some I think for family education, et cetera, but for family focused services. So, family counseling or something that would help to kind of address the emotional well-being of the family piece. Other research I've done, this was not specific to ASD, but has shown that services for the family unit are just as important for services for the child in terms of kind of the family's perceptions of how well they're doing. So those are the sort of general policy recommendations that I would suggest.
Mhm.
I would agree with those that you mentioned. That's also something that I'm seeing in the interviews, that I've done, is that families are having, they're given all this money and then they don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. For families that have newly immigrated here, they don't speak the language. People that grew up here and were born in Canada, like, have difficulty navigating services. So you can only imagine how much difficulty you would experience as a parent when you're still trying to, come to terms with the diagnosis, and then also trying to figure out this very, very complicated system, and long wait lists and things like that. All this paperwork that you have to do. You can only imagine how difficult it is not being able to speak the language. Yeah. Does anyone else have any policy recommendations? It's a really good question.
It's a good question.
I may suggest it may be related to my work here.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the government or the community try to help the group of families with different cultural background to support the community of their own language or ethnicity. Because when I started to support our family community members here in BC, it was very hard to get help or support from the community. I needed to do these things just on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are some supports or even funding for those organizations or the group of people who try to help other families with the same cultural background, that might be one of the suggestions I would like to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion.
I think one of the government documents, both saying you translated that whole book yourself,
Mm-hmm.
Without any support.
Yeah, I tried to get funding from different organizations, but I was not successful. So we had to do by ourselves with our own times and yeah. And another comment, a different one. I think the needs would be different depending on the severity of disability.
Mhm. Right.
So if there's a high functioning group of families, may think, suppose like a career is the most important thing.
Mm.
But with the relatively more severe disability family groups, they don't care about career development.
Mhm.
They want to have more funding from government, something like that. So even though the samples are a very small number of people, but if we divide these two groups, like a relatively high functioning and relatively low functioning, then their definition of quality of life might be different.
Mhm. Yep. Very good. That's a very good point. In this project with the Korean families, I think we asked that question of severity and presence of behavioral problems to try to characterize the sample, so that when we provide recommendations, we're being specific to which population we're talking about. So that's a really good point.
Someone else in the comments mentioned that culturally sensitive assessments are great for occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech behavior, that there needs to be more research like this. Do you guys want me to kind of close out this session?
Sure, I think, let's see if I can stop sharing. There we go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vanessa and Emily. This was really interesting and a topic that I don't know that much about.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to talk about it.
I'm sure we'll ask you to come back. And then once again, here's all of our information on our social media. We also have a website, asdreach.com. If you're interested, if you're a parent and you want to participate in some of our user testing and some interviews that we're doing, we would really appreciate that. So thank you again, everyone, for joining and participating. Thank you, Vanessa and Emily, for a really informative talk. And thank you, Ahud, for organizing it.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Say.